Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. You guys know how this works by now. You send us the stuff you're curious about, and we dive in. Today we're taking a look at those two Vladimir Putin biographies you all sent over. Now I know what you're thinking, another Putin deep dive. But trust me, we're going beyond the headlines, beyond the tough guy image you see everywhere, and try to figure out what really makes this guy tick, like what motivates him, how he actually operates, and maybe even see if there's something we can all learn from his approach. Plus, I'm really curious about this whole tough guy versus, like, surprisingly generous thing the sources hinted at. It's a wild combo.
It is a fascinating contrast.
Yeah.
And speaking of contrasts, it's amazing how much someone's early life can shape their whole path. Let's start with Putin's childhood. We're talking street fights in a rough Leningrad neighborhood. Growing up in a cramped communal apartment, not exactly a silver spoon start, right?
No kidding. Definitely not your average world leader origin story. And get this, one of the sources even mentioned that he got fascinated with the KGB because of a spy film. Like it's straight out of a movie.
You know, that little detail about the spy film really struck me? It shows how powerful stories are, even fictional ones, especially when you're young.
Yeah.
And then you think about what his actual life was like back then, always having to prove himself, scrambling for resources, outsmarting everyone just to get by. It starts to make sense why he'd be so focused on power and control.
Yeah, I can see how that environment would shape you. But one thing that really jumped out at me from the sources was this weird mix of, like, tough exterior, but then these really personal details. I mean, this is a guy who projects this image of total control.
Yeah.
But he was calling his parents all the time from his KGB post in Germany.
Right. It's easy to forget that even people who seem larger than life are still human. They have feelings, attachments, That devotion to his parents really complicates the picture.
Totally. And speaking of complications, the sources also said he wasn't a great student at first. But once he got into intelligence work, bam, dedicated learner. It's like he found his thing and all that potential just kind of clicked.
Absolutely. Like, finding your purpose can unlock so much. It's a great lesson for all of us. That spark that makes you passionate can really lead to amazing things.
Okay, so we've got this foundation. Tough childhood, late bloomer in terms of finding his passion, hints of maybe more going on beneath the surface than we see. Now let's fast forward to his rise to power. Because, seriously, this guy's career is anything but normal. KGB agent to St. Petersburg politics, then he just shoots up through Yeltsin's government, prime minister, then president. I mean, was it luck or was there something more strategic going on?
That's the big question, isn't it? The sources definitely make it seem like he was really good at being in the right place at the right time, almost like he had a plan all along.
Right. Like always thinking a few steps ahead. And then there's that whole Medvedev tandem presidency thing. On paper, it looked like they were sharing power. But was that really what was happening? Or was Putin just pulling the strings from behind the scenes the whole time?
The Medvedev years are really interesting. Makes you wonder what leadership really means. Is it about having the title? Or is it about influencing things even when you're not officially in charge?
Putin definitely seems to be good at that second part. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Because the sources start showing this real paradox at the heart of his character. On the one hand, there's the crackdown on dissent, silencing critics, and those really disturbing allegations of targeted assassinations.
You can't ignore those actions. They show a willingness to use force to eliminate threats and maintain control no matter what.
Absolutely. But then on the other hand, we get these stories about him being almost surprisingly generous, expensive gifts to friends, stepping in to help regular people in need, even a genuine love of animals and nature. It's like two completely different sides of the same guy.
That's the puzzle of Putin. Can someone be truly compassionate and ruthless? Is the kindness real, calculated? Or maybe both?
One story that stuck with me was how he gave this really fancy watch to a random shepherd he met while visiting the countryside. It seemed like a totally random act of generosity. But you have to wonder what was really behind it.
It's a perfect example of how hard it is to interpret his actions. Every gesture, every public appearance can be read in multiple ways.
Okay, so we've got this complex picture emerging. A tough upbringing, a strategic climb to power, and this blend of ruthlessness and what seems like genuine compassion. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
And that's the challenge of understanding Vladimir Putin. He's a master of ambiguity, of keeping his true intentions hidden. He defies easy categorization.
All right, so we've laid out the puzzle pieces. Now I think it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of how he actually operates. Because these sources lay out a whole playbook of power moves and tactics, and honestly, some of them are pretty fascinating, even if you're not running a country.
Absolutely. Putin's leadership gives us a window into how power and influence really work. Whether you're leading a team at work, negotiating a deal, or just trying to understand the world around you. There's something to learn from studying his methods.
Okay, so first up, information control. This one is huge, right? Shaping the narrative through the media, rewriting history, silencing anyone who disagrees. It's all about controlling information to stay in power.
And in today's world, where we're drowning in information from everywhere, that idea of information control is more relevant than ever. Think about how you sort through all the noise, how you figure out what to believe and who to trust. Those are crucial skills these days.
It's like we need to become our own personal fact checkers.
Exactly. And that's something Putin understands perfectly. He's a master of manipulating information to control how people see things.
Okay, next up on the list, power plays. And Putin's got a whole arsenal of these. Those backhanded compliments that leave you wondering if you've been insulted or praised. The strategically showing up late to meetings to show who's boss. It's like he studied the art of messing with people's heads.
Those tactics are so interesting because they show how well he understands human psychology. He's playing on people's insecurities, their desire for approval, all those little cues that affect how we interact with each other.
One of the sources even had a story about him using his dog to intimidate Angela Merkel. Knowing she was afraid of dogs, that's taking power plays to a whole new level.
Maybe not one we should all try, but it does highlight the importance of understanding people's weaknesses, their fears, their motivations, not to exploit them, but to navigate relationships more effectively.
It's like a real-life game of chess, where the stakes are sky high. Okay, last tactic we got to unpack. Relationship management, Putin style. He's big on loyalty tests, cutting off anyone who seems like a threat, and using that system of favors and connections, blat. It's worthless, but you can't argue with the results.
But it's such a fascinating concept. It shows how these networks of favors and connections operate across cultures and throughout history. It's all about using those relationships to get what you want.
It makes you wonder if that system gives him a huge advantage, especially in Russia, where those networks are so deeply ingrained.
It's definitely a factor, and it raises some serious questions about ethics. When does using your connections become unfair? When does it cross the line into corruption?
It's a gray area for sure, and gray areas seem to be where Putin thrives.
Exactly. He's a master of navigating those complexities, exploiting loopholes, bending the system to his will.
So we've got a good grasp of his tactics. Information control, power plays, strategic relationship management. But the question that keeps popping up for me is, what really motivates this guy? Is it pure power? A desire to make Russia great again? Or something even deeper and more personal?
That's the million-ruble question that everyone wants to answer. The sources give us some hints, but ultimately Putin's inner world remains a mystery.
Maybe that's part of his strategy too. Keeping everyone guessing, never revealing his true hand.
It's certainly possible, and it makes him incredibly difficult to predict and to counter.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. But this is just the beginning. We've laid the groundwork. Now it's time to delve even deeper into the enigma of Vladimir Putin.
It's funny you should mention Putin keeping his true intentions hidden, because that idea of a hidden motivation, a why behind everything he does, is something that came up a lot in your notes. It seems like everyone wants to understand what makes him tick.
Totally. It's like we've got all these pieces of the puzzle laid out. His tough childhood, his strategic brilliance, even those glimpses of generosity. But we're still missing that one key piece that explains the whole picture. Why does he do what he does?
Well, one theory from the sources goes back to something we talked about earlier, his childhood. Imagine growing up in post-war Leningrad, surrounded by hardship, having to fight for everything. It's not hard to see how that could create a deep need for control, a need to shape the world around you instead of being controlled by it.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like he's overcompensating for that early feeling of powerlessness, determined to prove he's not that vulnerable kid anymore.
It's a compelling narrative. And it fits with some aspects of his leadership style, the constant pursuit of stability, the intolerance of any kind of dissent, even those big displays of strength on the world stage. It could all be seen as a way of asserting control, warding off any threat.
Okay, so maybe it's about control. But one of the sources also went into his deep patriotism, almost a belief that Russia is exceptional. It's like he really believes he's meant to restore Russia to its former glory, make it a superpower again.
That's a crucial element to consider. Putin often frames his actions in terms of national interest, protecting Russia from enemies, restoring its rightful place in the world. And that message really resonates with a lot of Russians, especially those who remember the chaos after the Soviet Union collapsed.
So is it about power for himself or power for Russia? Or is it both? Like his own ambitions are tied to what he sees as Russia's destiny?
It's a fascinating question. Is he driven by a personal desire for power, or by a genuine belief that he's the only one who can save Russia? Maybe it's a mix of both. Personal ambition woven together with nationalistic fervor.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to separate the two.
Exactly. And that complexity is part of what makes Putin so fascinating and so enigmatic. He doesn't fit neatly into any category. He's a master of playing different roles, presenting different sides of himself to different people.
Okay, so we're still trying to figure out the why. But in the meantime, I'm really interested in those specific actions you highlighted. You wanted to understand how his tactics play out in the real world, right?
Absolutely. Understanding Putin's tactics isn't just about analyzing his leadership. It's about recognizing those patterns of influence and manipulation. They exist everywhere, from the boardroom to politics to even our personal relationships.
Okay, so let's get specific. You had a few examples in your notes. First up, the annexation of Crimea. Bold move for sure. But was it genius or just reckless?
The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a major turning point in Putin's presidency. It showed he was willing to use military force, and it shocked the world.
But from his perspective, it was a brilliant move, right? He took control of a strategically important region, tapped into Russian nationalism, and basically redrew the map of Europe.
From a purely strategic risk point, it was a gamble that paid off, at least in the short term. The long-term consequences are still playing out, though. It led to sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and a lot more tension with the West.
So a win in the short term, but maybe causing new problems down the road. It's like that chess player mentality, sacrificing a pawn to gain control of the board.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, how far is Putin willing to go? Is he playing a long game, one that could take decades and reshape the world, or is he more reactive, taking opportunities as they come up and improvising as he goes?
Okay, let's move on to another example you had, the intervention in Syria. A whole different chessboard. What was the play there?
The Syrian intervention in 2015 was a bold move that put Russia back in the spotlight. It showed Putin was willing to use military power far from home, and it made him a key player in one of the most complicated conflicts in the world.
But what was he trying to achieve? Was it about supporting an ally, countering the West's influence, or something else entirely?
It was probably a combination of things. Supporting Assad kept Russia's influence in the Middle East, and it was a chance to show off their military power. It was also a way to push back against the West, in a region that Russia sees as strategically important.
So it was a way of showing the world that Russia is powerful, but it also came with big risks.
Definitely. The Syrian conflict is a mess, and Russia's involvement has been criticized by human rights groups. It's also created more tension with the West, and raised concerns about Russia supporting authoritarian regimes.
It seems like Putin's willing to take big risks, to play the long game, even if it means getting involved in messy and potentially expensive conflicts.
That seems to be a big part of his leadership. He's not afraid to make bold moves, even if they're risky. And he's always thinking strategically, positioning Russia for advantage in the future.
This is giving me a whole new appreciation for Putin's strategic thinking. Even if I don't agree with everything he does, it's like he's always thinking 10 steps ahead, anticipating his opponent's moves, and playing the game on his own terms.
That strategic mindset is definitely impressive, even if we don't agree with the goals. It reminds us that thinking strategically is valuable in any field, whether it's politics, business, or even our personal lives.
Okay, so we've analyzed Crimea, Syria. What other examples from your notes can help us understand how he actually puts these tactics into practice?
Well, you were especially interested in his approach to domestic politics, specifically how he manages dissent and how he stays in control within Russia.
Yeah, that's always puzzled me. How does he stay in power for so long in a country with such a turbulent history? What's the secret?
There's no easy answer, but the sources highlight a few key strategies that seem to work for him.
Oh, tell me everything.
One tactic that comes up again and again is his use of propaganda and information control.
Propaganda. That's not a word you usually hear when talking about modern Russia. But the sources were pretty clear that it's a big part of how Putin stays in power.
It's not the same kind of in-your-face propaganda as the Soviet Union. It's way more subtle, more sophisticated. It's about shaping the story, controlling what information gets out, and subtly reinforcing certain values and beliefs.
So what does that look like in everyday life for Russians?
Think about the media. Independent outlets have been pushed to the margins. They face harassment, intimidation. Sometimes they're just shut down. Meanwhile, state-controlled media is everywhere. On TV, on the internet, presenting a very specific version of reality, one that helps the Kremlin's agenda.
So it's not about outright censorship. It's more about making sure dissenting voices get drowned out by the official story.
Exactly. And it works. If people hear the same message over and over from different sources, they start to accept it as true. It becomes part of how they see the world.
And that goes back to what we talked about with information control. It's like he's using the same tactics at home that he uses internationally.
It's definitely a pattern. He understands the power of narratives,
Yeah.
of shaping perceptions. And he's willing to use those tools to get what he wants, whether it's projecting strength to the world or maintaining stability within Russia.
Okay, so propaganda and information control are part of it. But what about actually stopping dissent? What does he do to people who openly challenge him?
That's where things get a little more troubling. The sources talk about a systematic approach to silencing critics, often using a combination of legal pressure, intimidation, and sometimes even violence.
So we're talking about things like jailing political opponents on fake charges, using the courts to shut down critical media, even resorting to extrajudicial methods to deal with threats.
Those are all tactics that have been reported by human rights groups and independent journalists. It creates a climate of fear where people are afraid to speak out, afraid to criticize the government, even afraid to express different opinions in private.
It's like that saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But in Russia, under Putin, that fear is very real. It's a powerful tool for control.
That fear is a key part of his strategy. It's about making people censor themselves, making them afraid to take risks, making them conform to the rules because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't.
This is a pretty scary thought, living in a place where you can't speak your mind, where you're always looking over your shoulder, and where speaking out against the government can have terrible consequences.
It's a sobering reminder of how fragile freedom can be, of how important a free press is, and of the need to hold leaders accountable for what they do.
Okay, so we've got the propaganda, the information control, the suppression of dissent. But how does he stay so popular? Because despite all of this, he still has pretty high approval ratings in Russia.
That's another piece of the puzzle. And the sources offer a few possible explanations.
All right, let's hear them.
One factor is how effective his propaganda machine is. If people are only exposed to one side of the story, if they're constantly hearing messages about Putin's strength and leadership, it's not surprising that many would believe it.
So it's partly about creating this image of him as the essential leader, the only one who can protect Russia.
Exactly. That image is carefully built up by state media, by his public appearances, even by staged events that are designed to show off his strength and charisma.
Like those photos of him riding shirtless on a horse or practicing judo.
Those images are very deliberate. They're part of a carefully crafted persona, one that projects strength, vitality, a connection to traditional Russian values, and they appeal to a lot of people.
It's like he's playing the role of the strongman, the protector of the nation, a powerful image, especially in a country with Russia's history.
That historical context is crucial. Many Russians see Putin as a source of stability, as someone who brought order after the chaos of the 90s, and restored Russia's place on the world stage.
So there's a sense of gratitude for the stability he brought, even if it came at the cost of some freedoms.
It's a trade-off that many Russians seem to accept. And it shows that in times of uncertainty, people often want a strong leader, even if that leader has flaws.
Okay, so we've got the propaganda, the strongman image, the stability factor. But there's also a more cynical explanation, right? The idea that people support him out of fear or because they don't see any other choice.
That's a valid point. When dissent is suppressed, when opposition figures are silenced, and when state media controls the narrative, it's hard to know what people really think.
So it's possible that Putin's popularity isn't as real as it seems, that it's based on a combination of propaganda and lack of alternatives.
We have to consider that possibility, and that's why it's so important to support independent voices in Russia, to challenge the official story, and to give people a platform to express different views.
So it's not just about understanding Putin, it's about understanding the system he's created, the forces that shape public opinion, and the challenges faced by people who try to challenge him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It reminds us that our own understanding of the world is shaped by what we see and hear, by the stories we're told, and by our own biases.
It's like we're all caught in this web of information and misinformation. And we have to make an effort to step back, to think critically about our sources, and to form our own opinions.
That's what critical thinking is all about. And it's more important now than ever.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a ride. We've covered so much ground. Putin's childhood, his tactics for gaining and holding power, his strategic brilliance, the ethical questions surrounding his leadership. And honestly, I have more questions now than when we started.
That's what makes a deep dive so interesting. It's not about finding all the answers, it's about sparking curiosity, challenging what we think we know, and encouraging us to keep learning.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this?
I think the main thing is that Vladimir Putin is a complex and fascinating figure. He's a product of his time, a master strategist, and a leader who has had a huge impact on Russia and the world.
Whether you admire his strength or condemn his actions, he's definitely a force to be reckoned with.
Absolutely. And understanding his motivations and his methods is crucial for understanding global politics and for making sense of the world we live in.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm going to be looking at the news in a whole new way now.
That's what we hope for, to give you knowledge, to encourage you to think critically, and to inspire you to keep asking questions and learning.
That's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And to all our listeners out there, keep those brains engaged and keep those questions coming. Until next time.